Welcome again to How It's Restored. My name is David Cooper. I'm talking to you about the restoration of a 1938 Peugeot 402 competition roadster. We're talking about the restoration of a 1938 Peugeot 402 Darl'mat competition roadster. And this is a car that had been previously restored. Came into us as a restored car. So it had been painted, it had been cleaned up, it was presentable, it looked very nice. But it wasn't the way that Dorothy Patton had had it. It wasn't the way that the car had been at its most significant moment. And there were a number of things that had to be re-restored or re-corrected for the previous restoration. And this is a big process. When we're restoring a car from the 1930s, this kind of construction of car, this is a car where the chassis is the structure of the car and holds all the mechanical items. And then on top of the chassis, the body has been mounted. The body is made, usually the structure of the cabin of the body is made of wood, and everything is covered with sheet metal. The sheet metal on the fenders and such. But the real structure of the car is the chassis. So when we restore a car like this, we have to go through all the mechanical components, the structural components and everything, things you don't even notice or see or even have any knowledge of if you don't know how these cars are constructed. You know, because the chassis is the main structural member of these cars, the chassis becomes the main component that identifies these cars. So sometimes some of the manufacturers would stamp numbers in the chassis, some didn't, but chassis numbers were always assigned to the car, and sometimes they were placed on a separate badge as what Peugeot would do. Let me make a quick distinction. In those days, when you're talking about a car like this where the body is mounted on the chassis, a company like Peugeot would make the chassis, they'd make the mechanical engine, they'd make the drivetrain, they'd make the radiator, they'd make all the mechanical components, the steering, but they wouldn't necessarily supply the body. The body would go to a coach builder. A coach builder was a custom body manufacturer at the time, and in this case the coach builder was Portu. Marcel Portu was a famous coach builder in France outside of Paris. They would go to him for the design and building of the body. Portu had a very famous designer working for him named Georges Paulin, who didn't survive World War II, was a really brilliant guy, and he's the one who designed the shape of the Peugeot Darl'mat in the first place. The Darl'mat was called Darl'mat because a dealer of Peugeot named Darl'mat ordered custom sports cars to be made and had Portu make custom bodies. Peugeot would make the chassis, and they added a sports car under the name Darl'mat to their line. One of the things that makes the Peugeot Darl'mat Roadster so unique is the windshield, because the windshield is controlled so that you can raise and lower it, and when it's raised, it's in its up position as it is now. Or you can turn a crank and lower the windshield through a gear mechanism and lower it all the way down so it's flush with the body. And Dorothy Patton often ran the car with a competition windshield she mounted on top of the body, had the windshield rolled down, but there were different times when the car was raced with the windshield up for weather or for wind resistance or whatever different purposes. The brakes on the Peugeot competition roadsters are drum brakes. And drum brakes are brakes where you have an external cast iron, usually, drum or housing, and there's shoes that are pushed out onto that drum. So the drum is attached to the wheel, it's spinning. The shoes are fixed, and they push on that brake, and the friction between the shoe and the brake is what causes that brake to slow the car down. What this brake is it's got a cable-operated system, much simpler and more mechanically straightforward, and people who designed mechanical things like this idea. But the idea is that when you push the pedal, you're pulling a cable, and that cable is expanding the shoes in the brakes. So it's just a lever, and the lever moves, and when the lever moves, it moves a cam which pushes the shoes out, and the shoes are pressing on the inside of the drum. One of the advanced things that Peugeot did with the Darl'mat, it was an option, but it was an option on almost all of the cars used of the roadsters, was using what's called a Total electromagnetic shifting transmission. It's a very unusual, advanced transmission for its era. And Total, it was a French development. It was mostly used on French cars. There were a couple other kinds of people experimenting with different kinds of automatic or semi-automatic shifting at the time. This ultimately led to automatic transmissions. But this particular transmission, the Total, was a electromagnetic transmission. In that sense, you have a gear shift that shifts between the various gears. That's just a series of switches. 1, 2, 3, 4. You're activating a switch to the transmission. And you would only use the clutch. It has a clutch. You'd use the clutch to go into forward or reverse, but you wouldn't use the clutch after that. Once the car is moving, you could shift the car with a little shifting mechanism, and it would go instantly shift to the next gear automatically, and you wouldn't have to touch the clutch at all. I mean, you know, there's different kinds of steering systems that the Peugeot engineers could have chosen. And, you know, common on many cars today is a rack and pinion system. A rack and pinion system is actually what they use on the windshield. But Peugeot liked a worm drive system. A worm drive system is like a rack and pinion, except that it doesn't use a flat rack. It uses a round worm, one gear driving another worm gear that's turning your steering mechanism. And worm gear drive is a very precise steering system. You can adjust how little play it is. It's very strong. So the Peugeot engineers like a worm drive for both the gear for the steering and also for the rear differential is also a worm drive. That's very unusual. Most people don't do a worm drive differential on cars. There were two kinds of paint primarily used at that time. There's a lacquer paint made with a nitrocellulose base, nitrocellulose lacquer. There was a synthetic resin base that was developed at the end of the 30s also. It was mostly developed, the synthetic resin was developed for appliances but applied to cars because it was a little less labor intensive than this type of paint. But this car was, Peugeot Darl'mats were painted with a nitrocellulose lacquer, which is a wonderful paint. It gives a very glass-like finish. The paint is different than modern paint. Modern paint is very plasticky looking. And part of the reason for that is how the color and the chemistry of the paint work. The way leather was tanned and the way leather was dyed in the 30s is different than we use today. And we wanted to put it back to a surface dyed leather from a vat dyed leather, and we wanted to do it in a way that was authentic to the color that Dorothy Patton chose for her car. She wanted a very specific dark blue that complemented the light blue outside, and it was very much her aesthetic that we're going for. And the shape, because we had photographs of the seats, we could match the shape of the seats exactly to what she had and correct the previous seats that weren't quite made correctly. Another thing that we've gone to a lot of trouble in our restoration process to learn about is about chrome. The reason chrome was used for the bumpers for the trim on those days was because it was durable, resisted scratching. It was a very hard finish and a workable finish. So if the bumpers got rubbed against each other or rubbed against something you bumped into, they wouldn't just scratch. And today, everybody uses decorative chrome. A lot of my customers ask me about tires, and tires are considered a wearing part on these cars. We have to replace the tires with new tires, but we have to have them made in the correct size. In France, these tires were made with a 400 millimeter diameter, which is around 16 inches. But we have to buy a 400 millimeter tire in the correct size, fit it to the wheel, and these are made with modern rubber construction, but at the same time are made to the traditional size. In those days, when these cars were made, lead was added to the fuel to slow down the burning process, and that's called the octane rating. We have to work with modern fuels. We can't work with the traditional lead fuels. That's not available anymore. I mean, some of the race gas is still available in a leaded version. Some of the airplane gas is still available, but that's not the right fuel for what these cars were designed for. That's a wonderful question. Why are there two fuel caps on this car? Because when you drive into a fuel station, you don't know which side the filler's on. So they made it, both fuel caps on this car feed the same single tank. Just makes it more convenient for filling. You know, these cars don't have seat belts. They weren't designed to be a car that would have crash impact like modern cars do. They weren't crash tested at all. This idea of seat belts in a car was designed when the car structure is to hold you safely and they don't want you moving around the car. In those days, they weren't worried about that. And I was told by a very famous race driver, Rene Dreyfuss, he said the best thing that could happen to you if the car flipped over is that you'd fall out and the car wouldn't land on you. And if you had a seat belt, keep you from falling out of the car. These were considered state-of-the-art competition cars at their time. The suspension on these cars was either leaf springs, sometimes coil springs, but mostly leaf springs because they would locate the axle and the parts. A lot of these cars did not have an independent rear suspension. Sometimes they had an independent front suspension. The idea being that that was the way the cars were made in those days. And so, you know, if you're used to modern race car, you get into a car like this, it seems very crude and slow and awkward and doesn't handle so well. But on the other hand, if you're trying to understand how people were really driving in the 1930s, you have to know what conditions and cars and types of things they were dealing with. There are no electronics. Let's be clear. Let's be clear with a car like this. There are no electronics in a car like this. We have electrical systems in those days, and the electrical system was fairly simple. I mean, you had to power the headlights and the taillights and brake lights if you had them, and some cars did and some cars didn't. You had to power turn signals or trafficators when cars had those. You know, when I first saw the pictures of this car and I realized Dorothy Patton had specifically chosen the badges she wanted on the grille. And we have pictures of her where she's first put the badges on the grille in one position and then she lines them up on later pictures. And by mid-39, they're lined up the way they are on the car now. And we went to a lot of trouble with badge experts because, again, it's hard to be expertise on everything in restoration. I went to a lot of trouble to figure out what the badges were and how to get the correct badges for this car. They were missing on the car when we got it. There were no badges on the car at all. I think they had been sold off because they were quite rare and valuable. I learned immediately that all the badges on this car were date-coded, so that when you found a badge, you not only had to find the correct badge, like the AA badge or the Brooklands badge, but they had to be date-coded to that particular year. So that was an interesting problem to find them. But the middle badge was the real challenge, because the middle badge was an Agassi badge. Agassi was the French racing team that sponsored a bunch of the races. Drivers Association sponsored a bunch of races in France. And the Agassi, there was a pre-war and post-war Agassi badge. This is the pre-war badge. It's very, very rare. It was the hardest one to find of all these badges by far. I spent over a year and a half looking for an Agassi badge and trying to convince somebody that we needed one and they should sell it to us. I found a collector who had one and he was not willing to sell us a badge for a long time. He's finally persuaded to do so because he learned that we were not badge collectors, other badge collectors, that we were actually going to put this badge back on a car that had it originally, reasonable amount of money, and you don't want to. If you can find an original piece, it's much more exciting. So these are all original 1938-39 badges on this car. Now that we've discussed the detailed components of the car, let's talk about what we had to do to restore the car.